Thank you all very, very much. I want to say what an honor it is to be here today, first with so many friends who are here, but also at an event honoring Mike Harrington, who, in a way, as we talk about the problems he underscored. First of all, being at the museum is very cool because they have all of those sort of misfiring headlines around, and I just noticed one that seemed to be perfect for this conference. The headline was, "Food stamp recipients turn to plastic." Yeah, so it's gotten that bad. I love Mike Harrington, and he did with one book what research centers spend millions of dollars trying to do. He got the attention of two presidents and changed our national policy. And one of the things I loved about Harrington is that he was not a grim do-gooder. He was somebody who was ebullient. He loved life. He had a wide circle of friends, including people he disagreed with. One of my favorite encounters Harrington ever had was with Bill Buckley, when Buckley was debating him. And Buckley actually liked to debate Harrington because he knew how smart Harrington was. And at this event, Mike Harrington was introduced as America's leading socialist. And Bill Buckley looked up and said, "America's leading socialist. That would be a bit like being the tallest building in Topeka." And when you think about the influence Harrington had and the fact that he actually was a socialist, unlike so many people who are called socialists, it's really remarkable. And what I'd like to do, I have my 47-year-old paperback copy of The Other America with me that I pulled down from my shelf. And before we turn to the very specific discussion, I did want to read two paragraphs which have probably been read already, but not everyone has read them. And I just want to ask the panel to react to them. I'm going to introduce the panel first, and then I'll read the passage and turn to John Carr as the first commenter on this. Robert Bixby is executive director of the Concord Coalition, a nonpartisan organization dedicated to fiscal responsibility. John Carr is executive director of the Department of Justice, Peace, and Human Development at the United States Catholic Bishops Conference. And Bob Greenstein, I think everybody here knows, is the founder and president of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and has written on just about everything related to the topics of the day: fiscal policy, programs and policies to deal with poverty, healthcare, taxes, and Social Security. Before, Bob was saying that the healthcare decision had made things especially busy, and I've never known Bob not to be busy. So I don't know what this is like compared to other times. But here are the last two paragraphs of The Other America. He said about the poor, "They exist within the most powerful and rich society the world has ever known. Their misery has continued while the majority of the nation talked of itself as being affluent and worried about neuroses in the suburbs. In this way, tens of millions of human beings become invisible. They dropped out of sight and out of mind. They were without their own voice, or their own political voice. Yet this need not be. The means are at hand to fulfill the age-old dream. Poverty can now be abolished. How long shall we ignore this underdeveloped nation in our midst? How long shall we look the other way while our fellow human beings suffer? How long? How long, John?
Too long. Michael, I didn't know him, but read him. Couldn't find my book last night in my basement. But there were two institutions, many friends, but there were two institutions that he really loved and he was very disappointed in. And one was the Catholic Church and the other was democratic politics. So I'm sort of here working for the Catholic Church, and I think he would be disappointed in my church, but he'd also be disappointed where we are. He would find it unbelievable that we're at the highest level of poverty since we've been keeping these numbers, and we have silence in the political debate. Think of the response to the Supreme Court decision after CNN and Fox and all that running around. Everything was focused on the mandate, whether it was a tax, whether it was a penalty, whether it was a victory for the president, whether it was a loss for Romney, whether he could figure it out. And there was a whole other piece to the Supreme Court decision that said that states would not be required in any meaningful way to expand Medicaid, which affects millions and millions of poor people. And we're still waiting for the real debate on that. So I think the silence surrounds us. I think we could have a presidential campaign where we have these very high levels of poverty that are increasing, and we'll have no discussion of what that means for the poor, for the rest of us, for our country, why it has come about, and what we can do about it. And I think that silence is an indictment. It's an indictment of us, it's an indictment of our leaders, and it's an indictment of what we stand for. I'm of the view that we can make a lot of cases why addressing poverty is important. It's in our self-interest. It would help the country grow. It would help stability. It would improve race relations and all sorts of things. But the case we need to make is a moral case. This is not right in the richest nation on earth, that so many of our sisters and brothers don't have the basics. That's one message. It's not right. And we can do better. And that was Michael's message. And we've been talking today about how we can do better. So he would be dumbfounded that we've fallen back. He would be appalled by the silence. And he would repeat what you've read from him. We can do better.
Do you have a thought on this? Do you think, I mean, you've been working on these issues for a long time, Bob. Are these questions, are the poor even more invisible to us than they used to be? How can they be brought into the center of these policy discussions?
Actually, I think they're much less invisible than when Harrington wrote the book. So just a personal memory. I remember being in high school around the time he wrote the book and thinking that the single biggest issue facing the country was nonconformity. And this was really before things like poverty were emerging and being discovered. It was there, but it really was invisible. Nobody would think now that it is not a significant issue, particularly given the budget debates that are coming. But what I find striking, it's the quote in the end where you had how long. So if you looked at the last several decades and you looked at public policy, there are ups and downs, but on the whole, it's been 2 steps forward, 1 step back, other than in cash public assistance where there's been a dramatic change since the late 90s. But if you look at a lot of other areas, refundable credits, the earned income credit, the gradual, 25 years ago, you pretty much had to be on welfare to get Medicaid. The working poor weren't eligible. Pell Grants, you go far enough back, didn't exist. But now we're at this moment, very unusual moment, where there's the potential for actually one of the biggest steps forward for low-income families in several decades, which would occur if the Medicaid expansion of the Affordable Care Act is fully implemented in every state, and one of the biggest holes in the safety net, millions of people below the poverty line being uninsured, is finally addressed. If that were to occur and the deficit reduction for the mid and long term that we need were to be achieved in a way that protects people at the bottom. But there's also a significant possibility that, depending on the outcome of the election, the entire Affordable Care Act is repealed, or perhaps even a majority of states do not take the Medicaid expansion, and more fundamentally, that we could achieve large-scale deficit reduction in a way that really devastates programs focused on low-income people, destroys the structure of Medicaid, SNAP, which we used to call food stamps, huge cuts in Pell Grants for low-income kids to afford college. I don't ever remember a time when there was the potential for as huge rollbacks as there is now. So it's this curious time where there could be significant advances, there could be devastating declines, and if you have this view, which I think I kind of have long had in the back of my head, that you win battles and you lose battles, but over the course of time, one gradually makes progress. In the period ahead, it's not clear that's true, particularly given the enormously controversial fiscal decisions that lie ahead. and what decisions, what are the outcomes on those battles is going to have a bigger impact, I think, on public policy toward poverty and the extent and depth of poverty than anything in many decades.
You know, I really appreciate that point. Richard Scammon and Ben Wattenberg wrote many years ago that liberals often seem to say our programs have failed, let us continue. And that it's actually helpful to point out how much actual progress there has been, and that we're in danger of walking away from that progress and then some, and going backward. And I just think that's important. Bob, I'd like to turn to you as one of the leading advocates of a balanced budget, a sustainable fiscal policy. Let me sort of ask, and I'd like to throw this out to the whole panel. Not only do I want to ask, how do you protect programs for the poor in a period when we're going to have cutbacks, but let's flip it around and say, how could programs to reduce poverty, expand health coverage, actually contribute to deficit reduction? So I'd like you to take it both ways. And do you think that's possible? I think it is possible, but I'm curious where you take it.
I think that that's an important way to look at it, because I think sometimes there's this false debate or a false premise that if you're in favor of deficit reduction, you talk about fiscal sustainability, that must mean that that it's all about cutting programs and sometimes cutting programs that are directed at anti-poverty efforts. And I don't think that needs to be the case. There shouldn't be this tension. If you have, one of the contributors to deficit reduction is a strong economy. And so if you have a growing economy, if you have, let me put it this way, if you're investing more in education, healthcare, things like that, that help people, that contribute to a stronger economy, more people working, more people paying taxes, that helps with the budget deficit. So if you're say expanding Medicaid, you can make the case. Obviously, it's an expensive thing to do, but you can make the case that it's contributing to a stronger workforce that would help the economy expand.
Bob and John, do you want to talk about that question of, in turning this argument around to say that helping the poor could actually be good for fiscal sustainability?
Well, clearly, other earlier panels talked about this more. If we were able to do more to have a more skilled, better educated workforce, that ought to have some impact on overall economic growth and yield some dividends. It's one of the reasons why I find one of the most distasteful proposals to be proposals to really take huge cuts out of Pell Grants at a point when college costs are rising quite rapidly and the gap. I think I've seen some data, I think it's an Economic Policy Institute graph on this, that if I remember correctly, the percentage of low-achieving high school students from high-income backgrounds who go to college is the same as the percentage of high-achieving high school students from low-income backgrounds who go to college. I mean, that really shouldn't be the case. The other big question here is the Medicaid program, because it has a cost trajectory going into the future that is part of all the analysis of lack of sustainability in the fiscal picture. And this leads people to sometimes think, okay, how am I going to cut Medicaid to get savings? Because we probably do need to slow the rate of growth of Medicaid along with Medicare as part of the larger fiscal picture. The problem is the people on Medicaid are poor. They can't afford to pay huge amounts for their care out of pocket themselves. We don't want to cut back on insurance and make poor people uninsured. And it already pays less than Medicare in the private sector. It costs 20 to 25% roughly less per person in Medicaid than providing health to the same people through private insurance. So the answer, there are individual things here and there with pharmaceutical pricing, but they're not huge in terms of the overall trajectory. So the savings in the long run in Medicaid relative to the costs that are now projected are dependent upon system-wide healthcare reform that slows the rate of growth of healthcare costs system-wide. and that's part of the challenge. That's largely outside Medicaid's control. And it unfortunately leads to policy prescriptions that would give us more of a two-tier healthcare system by doing big cuts in Medicaid. So the goal is to get system-wide healthcare reform where Medicaid provides actually better quality coverage than it does today, and covers all of the poor as it will if the Medicaid expansion and the Affordable Care Act is implemented, but does it at less cost in future decades than is now projected. And I think that's really right in the middle of the fiscal debate that's coming.
John, you believe in the miracle of the loaves and the fishes. How can we do more for the poor and achieve fiscal sustainability?
These religious metaphors are scaring me. I sort of feel we have Jeremiah over here saying the sky is falling, doom is on the way, and Isaiah saying the moral measure of the society is how we treat the poor and vulnerable. I tried to think of an optimistic prophet to describe EJ, but the best I could do was Micah, who said, do justice, walk humbly, and some other things. But I'm
honored, John.
Well,
I like Micah.
Well, I'm a Catholic. I don't know Scripture. My evangelical friends would help me. What strikes me about this is I tried to say that poverty is increasing, and no one's talking about it. That the deficit and the debt is increasing, and everybody talks about it, and nobody does anything. And what we have, I think, is a series of givens. For the Republicans, it's no new taxes, no tax increases of any kind. For the House Democrats, it's don't mess with Medicare. For the administration, it's increased taxes on those over $250,000, reinforced yesterday. For some, it's don't screw around with defense spending. The missing given is that the poor should not be left worse off as a result of deficit reduction and dealing with the debt. And people say, it's almost a cliche, the poor have the most to lose unless we deal with the debt and deficit, and that's true. But they will lose in the short run and the long run if we put everything else off the table and leave the discretionary spending on the table. Now, we have had a tradition in this country of when we try and get serious about this, of saying this should not leave low-income people worse off. Even Graham Rudman, Bowles Simpson, the sequester does not include Medicaid and food stamps. One of the challenges for us, I think, is we need to both defend resources but also advocate reform. The food stamp program is a much better program than it used to be, in part because of the work of Bob and others in this room. EITC is better run than it used to be. Frankly, the earlier panel talked about the problems with Pell Grants. Lots of kids are left with loans to pay off without a degree to show for it. A lot of the job training stuff is just a mess, which prepares people for jobs that don't exist. I think for folks like us who want to look at the budget debate and the deficit debate from the bottom up, it's not enough just to say we need resources to invest in the lowest income people. We also need the kind of reforms that have made food stamps and EITC and other programs better programs. It's really worth remembering that in this recession, poverty has gone up, but hunger has not. And the reason for that, this is a compassionate country that invests in food stamps, nutritional assistance. And it was a shame when one of the presidential candidates called the president, the food stamp president, he or nobody else stood up and said, we're a better country that we don't have hungry kids, that we have made this investment so that even if you lose your job, even if you lose your way in this economy, your kids don't go hungry. We have to find that voice again.
Bob, you want to come back in, and then I'll go to the
Yes,
other Bob.
I'm thinking more about your question of what could you do in deficit reduction that reduces poverty, it's good for the economy, et cetera. And in this vein, I think the venue to keep one's eye on is tax reform, which could turn out in a way that is a disaster for low-income working families, but it also could turn out, although the odds are against it politically, in a way that reduces the deficit, makes the economy more efficient, and reduces poverty at the same time. What am I talking about? So there's a very important set of articles written in 2004, 2005 by an interesting trio, Fred Goldberg, who was IRS Commissioner and Assistant Secretary of the Treasury in the first Bush administration, Peter Orszag, former OMB and CBO Director, now at Citi, and Lily Batchelder, who's a brilliant NYU law professor who's currently the Chief Tax Counsel for the Senate Finance Committee. And in this article, they point out that a number of the provisions of the tax code that are designed to incentivize certain kinds of behavior, going to college, saving for retirement, are really upside down. There are deductions in which the higher your tax bracket, the bigger the incentive per dollar that you put into the desired activity. And if you earn too little to owe income tax, you're ineligible for the incentive. And they point out that the people at the top are going to save for retirement anyway, that the foregone federal revenue is highly inefficient in being targeted to them, and where you would get the most bang for the buck in actually getting the desired activity, more retirement saving, more college attendance and graduation, would be at the bottom. So their proposal is to take a series of provisions such as these and convert them from deductions, where the higher your tax bracket, the bigger the benefit, to flat percentage refundable tax credits that include people who don't earn enough to owe income tax. You could design that in a way that yields significant net deficit reduction. It would be more efficient because per dollar of foregone revenue, you'd get more of the desired activity, which would be good for the economy, education, retirement saving. And you'd be reducing poverty at the bottom, and you'd be actually, if you made something in the tax code called the saver's credit, a refundable credit, you'd help low-income people save more for retirement, something of interest to organizations that work on asset building. Now, the odds that this would actually occur would be very tall against it. You'd have very powerful forces arrayed against it. You'd have significant members of both parties on the tax writing committees who wouldn't be for it. But from a rational policy standpoint, it would hit the trifecta. You reduce deficits, more efficient tax code economically, reduce poverty.
Well, we have found the loaves and fishes. It's deductions to credits. I mean, you know, I think that's very, very important. Let me go to Bob just to react to that. And can you talk about the various deficit reduction proposals, sort of Bowles-Simpson et al., in light of what they would mean to the lowest income Americans?
Well, I think the idea that Bob floated is a good one, and I think that what you need to be thinking about with all of these deficit reduction plans is, I mean, one of the criteria needs to be how does it affect poverty? Clearly, that has to be, you know, you want to have a fiscal sustainability plan, but you also want to have a plan that works socially as well, and that Americans will accept. So, you know, I was on the Rivlin-Domenici task force, and we followed, obviously, the work of Bowles-Simpson pretty closely. Some of the things that, you know, we explicitly thought about in doing tax reform was, would the tax code end up being at least as progressive as it is now? So the idea with both commissions was, could you broaden the base by streamlining credits, deductions, exemptions, exclusions, and end up with lower rates and still get higher revenues? It turns out you can do that. It politically is very, very difficult, but all of this stuff is politically very difficult. But a lot of the so-called tax expenditures are really middle-class entitlements run through the tax code. And so by limiting or scaling those back, you can make the tax code more progressive, in fact, and you have more money for deficit reduction or for lower rates if you want to. Both commissions ended up in that place, and I think that that is a way, I mean, I think that that's a good broad outline for tax reform. On the spending side, I think, Bob is right. The bottom line on the spending side is healthcare. It's got to be system-wide, not just in the government programs. Again, it's going to be a very difficult thing to achieve, but it's absolutely crucial that we do that. On what we did with, I think you have to look at Social Security and Medicare, which are obviously the biggest entitlement programs. I think you have to look at those as anti-poverty programs because, they are. I mean, they have been an extraordinarily successful in addressing poverty among the elderly. So in reforming those programs, which are on an unsustainable fiscal track, you need to do it in such a way that it does not undo the favorable effects that it's had. So I think a lot of the Social Security reforms, for example, would be aimed at upper income people, adjusting the benefit formula so that it's less progressive, raising the cap on the payroll tax, and the one that is
So it's less progressive or more progressive?
more progressive. Did I say less progressive? It should be more progressive, so that you don't want to end up totally means testing the program. You don't want to turn it into a welfare program. It's a social insurance program, but you can make the benefit formula more progressive. And I think one of the toughest issues with Social Security is the eligibility age, because it's one of the more talked about reforms. It is a benefit cut. It's an across-the-board benefit cut, and so the issue comes up of what, do you raise the early retirement age or not? And both commissions struggled with that issue. I think where we're going with this is probably having some reform that would keep an early eligibility age, but perhaps not the same way now, that there might be some conditionality to it to account for longer working years, but there are some categories, longer lifespans, but there are some categories of work that if you're in a career where 62 is still an age where you may need to retire, but not on disability. So I think that part of it still requires some real looking into. But to me, the bottom line for these, whether it's Simpson-Bowles or Rivlin-Domenici, we did look specifically at making sure that the tax reforms were at least as progressive, and in our case, I know we were a little bit more so than the current code. And in the entitlement reforms, that you had to do it in a way that protected the social safety net and did not, make poverty worse. You don't want to undo the good work that's done. And the final thought I'd say on that is, if you don't look at the entitlement programs, you do have a problem. If you don't look at defense, because you've got the defense budget has been ballooning. The programs that do get squeezed, and you can look at just what's happening now, are the domestic discretionary programs, which are not just anti-poverty programs, but the investments that you make, that the government makes in a stronger economy in the future, whether it's education, transportation, all the things that you think of that the government can do. Those are the things that are most vulnerable and are going to get squeezed. So, less focus on the domestic discretionary part of the budget, which is the least problematic. When you look at all the categories of federal spending, that is the least problematic of federal spending. We got to look at the entitlement programs, and we have to look at tax reform in a way that brings in more revenue, because increased revenue definitely has to be part of the deficit reduction puzzle.
As moderator, I'm entitled to one pet peeve that I can express and ask a question about. My pet peeve with so much of this talk about tax reform is that everybody insists that part of it should be to cut the rates. And I don't know why we need to cut the rates. In other words, this worked very well as an idea, perhaps, when the top rate was 50%. The last big tax reform, you were able to cut the rate because it was at 50%. Now at 35, the rate is actually historically low if you take it over a long trajectory. And it strikes me that so many tax reform proposals would end up, if you cut the top rate, you'd end up taking some benefits away from the middle class to cut the rate on the very wealthiest. I don't get that, and I don't see, if we clearly need revenue, and I'm going to get to that, to balance the budget and not eviscerate programs, why does everybody insist, let's reform the code and cut the rate? Let's just reform the code.
Can I answer that? It's because of the political deal that needs to be made. I mean, that's.
I think that's right. The answer is political. So it's interesting. People often say, well, the problem with having too high rates is then there's greater use made of tax shelters and tax breaks, and the code is less efficient. There's some very important recent academic work from Peter Diamond, the Nobel laureate, Emmanuel Saez, and others here. We did a paper summarizing the research a couple of months ago, and the conclusion you draw is, this is what I'm about to say is totally politically impossible, but the policy conclusion, the substantive conclusion you draw is, given the deficits we face, the best result would actually be to modestly raise the rates and broaden the base. If you broaden the base, if you raise the rates without broadening the base, you do have a concern about more tax sheltering. If you broaden the base at the same time, you address that problem, and in the Diamond-Saez paper, they suggest that the optimal revenue-raising rate is at least 48% and perhaps higher if you broaden the base. But none of that's in the discussion now. I mentioned earlier that tax reform could be a benefit, but could also be a threat. And then I forgot to come back and explain the threat. The threat is that if you have, let me back up. We all expect that in any deficit reduction deal, in the lame duck in January, whenever, it's not going to rewrite the whole tax code in that deal. The first bill would be a so-called framework bill, and it would then give Congress 4, 5, 6 months to do tax reform and maybe some entitlement changes, and it would give the tax writing committees presumably a revenue target. Now, in a lot of the bills that are around, and like in the Bowles-Simpson proposal, it would also up front say you have a revenue target, but your top rate couldn't be higher than 29%. That's in Bowles-Simpson. Well, if you want to raise enough revenue to make a significant contribution to deficit reduction, and you also have to pay for the cost of lowering the top rate to 29%, what you have to do to tax expenditures, you can design it on paper in an academic setting, but your chance of actually passing changes of that radical nature in the mortgage interest deduction and 401ks and charitable and the employer health exclusion and on is near zero. You can't do it. And so the question is what happens? And I think the risk is very high that either of two things happen. Either the revenue target gives way and you don't really get the revenue contribution, the deficit contribution you were supposed to from taxes, or the tax expenditure savings come in other places. And people I talk to on the Hill tell me that there's no question, given a lot of these discussions, that there's growing interest, particularly in House Republican ranks, in getting a significant share of the savings on the tax expenditure side to pay for lowering the rates in tax reform by really going after the refundable tax credits, particularly the earned income credit. It is a tax expenditure. Not all tax expenditures are bad. Some are very good, some are mixed bags, some are purely wasteful. But that's kind of why I was saying earlier there are big issues there. And there's another discussion I won't take the time to go into here, but Bob was mentioning Social Security and Medicare. And I think there are big issues in how to achieve savings there without really hurting low-income people. Bowles-Simpson, for example, has a very laudable principle of protecting people at the bottom. But when you look at the details of the Medicare and Social Security proposals, people like elderly widows at $12,000 a year get hit very hard. So the details are really important. There are ways to do it if you don't set your targets too high. One of the reasons I think Bowles-Simpson has so many problems in the Social Security part and what it does is it gets 2/3 of its solvency savings from benefit cuts initially and 4/5 ultimately. I think you probably have to have a significantly better balance between the two to possibly come up with a structure that doesn't hit low-income beneficiaries hard. But in all these things, tax reform, Medicare, Social Security, the details are really important. And the other lesson here is it's not enough to just focus on the means-tested programs, because as we're all saying, the tax system, Medicare, Social Security have huge impacts on low-income people as well. And you really got to get the specifics right there to avoid some really problematic outcomes.
I'm going to go with two more questions, and then I want to open it up to the audience. I want to ask a specific question to John Carr, and it's a kind of double-barreled or a kind of on the one hand, on the other hand question, which is, I think not enough attention got paid to how a variety of religious groups, and you were at the forefront of this along with other people like Jim Wallace, really fought and succeeded to a significant degree in protecting low-income programs in the rounds of budget cutting so far. You formed a circle of protection. Bread for the World was in it, Sojourners, Salvation Army, National Association of Evangelicals, and others. Could you, on the one hand, I would like you to talk about the success of that work and what you think religious organizations can do from here forward. The other side I'd like to ask you, which is an uncomfortable question for both of us since we're Catholics, is a lot of us have the impression that you have always been in the forefront on these issues, but that the church has allowed in recent years some other issues to kind of jump ahead of the poverty issue. And I'm curious how you see, not only both within the Catholic Church and in other religious denominations, the role of poverty and justice in their public ministries. So I'm essentially doing the good news and what I worry about, the bad news, in one question to you.
Well, I will get even with you.
This goes back a long way with us.
Let me take the second one first. You and I have had a debate for a long time. Which institution is in more trouble? The Catholic Church or American journalism? And if you read my brother's column yesterday in the New York Times, journalism is in tough shape, but I think we're giving you a run for your money. Part of it is, what is news when the church does it? We work every day. The three most important things I've been a part of in 20 years of work have been EITC, the refundable children's tax credit, and keeping the low-income programs out of the sequester. And we've done that with lots of people in this room. I don't think a story has been written about any of those things ever. And it didn't involve sex, it didn't involve lies, there was no videotape. But there is, I think, a real temptation to turn inward on the part of the church. Frankly, some of it justified. The definition of religion in the HHS mandate, I know we're not here for that, says you're not a religious ministry if you care for people who are not part of your faith or employ people not part of your faith. That's not good for our church. I would argue it's not good for the poor. So you have to focus on some of those things. We believe abortion is the destruction of an innocent child and have to stand up for that. But if you start with the Bible, and here I turn to my evangelical friends, Matthew 25, I know that part. The measure of our lives, the measure of our society, the measure of our faith is how you treat the least of these. And those are not the priorities of the House Ways and Means Committee. So the religious community has to stand up. Occasionally we break through. The bishops elected by their brothers wrote the House and outlined 3 criteria for the budget: how it affects life and dignity, how it treats the poor, and whether it advances the common good. And then when the budget was before the House, they said that this budget failed those tests, which got some attention. And so I think we're standing up there. My colleagues are in this room. We work every day. We work with Bob. We work with National Association of Evangelicals. And the Circle of Protection is a good example. This, frankly, moved from the middle out. This was not the left wing of the religious community. It was Salvation Army. It was National Association. No one's ever mistaken the Catholic bishops for MoveOn.org. My church is a lot of things. It's never been called trendy. But it also included the mainline Protestants, Bread for the World, Sojourners, and others. And we said a very simple thing, that there was a moral question as well as economic and political questions, that you had to look at the budgets from the bottom up, how it touched the least, and that, in fact, we were going to have the given that don't leave the poor better off. A couple things about that were really important. One is a restrained rhetoric. We didn't call anybody immoral. We were genuinely bipartisan. We met with everyone who would meet with us. We tried to be consistent. Let me conclude, and we were able to accomplish some things. Let me describe, and the journalists in the room, and I would ask you not to quote the details of this, but there were two meetings that I think were really important.
See how much trust John has, a room full of 200 people. I admire that.
Well, and apparently
300
there's
maybe.
a camera. My question is, who's the fat bald guy out there? I mean, I never think of myself that way. But there was a meeting with the President of the United States, and you had the head of the National Association, you had the Salvation Army, you had Sojourners, Bread for the World. But the key point in that meeting was when Bishop Ricardo Ramirez from Las Cruces, New Mexico, a Catholic bishop, turned to the president and said, in my Bible, it says, whatever you do for the least of these, you do unto me. He says, in Washington, that apparently is whatever you do for the forgotten middle class, you do unto me. That's not what the Bible says. And the president said, I think you've got us on that one. And then we made the appeal to exempt the low-income entitlement programs from any sequester. We met also with Representative Paul Ryan, who I think is a serious guy on this. And again, it was Bread for the World, National Association of Evangelicals, a Catholic Archbishop, and others, and it was a spirited discussion. I was not supposed to say something, but at the very end, I
You can't imagine that.
Yeah. I raised my hand and I said, Mr. Chairman, I am about to be a 62-year-old white male church bureaucrat, and I make a good living. And I've looked at your budget, and the best I can tell, you're not asking me to make one dime of sacrifice. My mortgage deduction's safe. My charitable deduction is safe. I'm looking forward to Social Security. I'm depending on Medicare. My IRA, such that it is okay. My daughter teaches school in Cherry Hill neighborhood in Baltimore, and I said, everything that community looks to for some help in terms of feeding their kids and making their schools better and providing job training and the tax credits, all of that is at risk in your budget. And I said it doesn't feel like shared sacrifice. And without quoting him in detail, he pointed out that there are the very powerful interests that make those things unattainable or off the table. So it's not about shared sacrifice, it's about political power. And one of the things we got to do is find a way to raise our voices, to organize, and to mobilize people, lots of people in this country, who think in a time of difficulty we ought to take care of those who are at the bottom. The one thing I would emphasize, and it's really important for us and for you, we do not want everybody on food stamps. We want everybody to be able to raise their kids by their work, a decent job at decent wages. So the other panels were really important, but there ought to be a real safety net, and it does make a difference. And if we go down the road that Bob talks about, we could lose what we have and end up worse. But I would hope that the church you and I are both a part of will be in the forefront of standing up for those values, whether the press covers it or not.
I hope you noticed. Thank you, John. I hope you noticed that he did get back at me because he named two institutions that were in deep trouble, and I'm part of both of them. I also, by the way, want to register my objection to the very title of this panel. I'm actually not very fond of austerity as a general matter. I'm going to go to the audience, but I want to put one question in the backs of everybody's head, particularly the two Bobs, as you answer the other questions, because Bob Greenstein in particular, you've been known as both a deficit hawk and a poverty reduction hawk. And so as you answer the other questions, I would like you to talk about where can one save money in some of these programs without actually hurting low-income people. And at some point, I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, but I want to go to the audience. There are mics going around the room. Why don't we go to the gentleman right in front here first. Thank you, sir.
Harley Johnson with the Advocates for the Other America. John, the scripture you were talking about in Micah, I wanted to start there. He said Micah was instructing the people that God wanted them to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before their God. And I think that's a good place to start. I commend the circle that you spoke about and Sojourners and the other Catholic bishops and others that are involved. It appears that I'm just amazed that we live in a country that spent so much in its preamble and also in its mission talking about, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we've fed the world over the years, and now we have trouble feeding our own, which doesn't make any sense to me. It just doesn't make any sense at all. And I'm just appalled at all of the austerity programs and also these budget decisions that cut the poor when we found out that so many people were not leaving poverty, but they're falling back into poverty. It seems like there ought to be more money now for the poor, especially since the country is in such bad shape. We know that the needs are greater, not less. And I'm just wondering, because you mentioned before about the voice, and it appears that the poor, they're not organized as unions are organized. They're not organized as church groups. They're not organized as Democrats or Republicans, but because they're more concerned about how they're going to find the next meal or the next ramen noodle or the next something like that. They're more concerned about that, and so they don't organize politically. But since they can, he said, let us do justice by them and let us show mercy. Let us become their voice. Let us raise our voices for those who cannot speak at this point in time. And I think we need to speak with one voice. And those who are in the press, who are in the room, they need to be raising their voices as well. They can bring this discussion to where it ought to be. And it appears that the political discourse in the country has really gone haywire. We've seen this before in other civilizations and other times, but that's not an excuse to do nothing. Shouldn't we be raising our voices greater and higher and with more velocity now, not less, especially those in the press, those of us who are in the progressive movement, those of us who are involved, and that appears to be what's lacking. We're allowing the politicians to go free because the poor cannot raise their voice in a unified way. We have to raise their voice for them in absence of them being able to do it themselves. And that appears to be what's lacking in this discourse. I mean, the politicians will only pay attention to whoever brings the question to them. We're not bringing them the question.
Thank you very much. Why don't we get a couple other thoughts in, and then I appreciate that. By the way, I especially appreciate your mentioning the preamble of the Constitution, which does talk about the general welfare. A lot of people don't realize that welfare is in the very first paragraph of the Constitution of the United States. But hang on to that thought, and let's go. Do we have a couple of others we could bring in? Right over here, way down to my left and your right.
Hi, thank you. My name's Ken Paris from the Communications Workers of America. A comment and then a question. Comment is, we have one part of the equation. Right now, we have policies that are austerity for the many, prosperity for the few. And our policies have been directed at that for decades. Wage productivity gaps, distribution of income, concentrated, lack of mobility, all those type of things. And while we've talked about austerity for the many, we haven't talked about the other part. What do we do about the prosperity for the few that's built on the austerity for the many? That's one question. Another question is directed at Robert Bixby. When you were talking about the deficit long term, you mentioned that most, if not all of it, is from the healthcare cost increases. So two questions based on that. One is, then why all this talk about cutting entitlements and things like that when the key question is healthcare costs? And the second part of that question is, what do you propose to solve the increase in healthcare costs that would really meet the deficit without cutting benefits?
Thank you. Why don't we go to Bob first in response to both of those? Go ahead.
I think on
Bob
the
to my left.
on the first question about the question about healthcare. I mean, you know, as that translates into the federal government, if you're talking about the deficit, it's primarily Medicare and Medicaid. I do think that making changes in those programs, primarily Medicare, can enhance, lead the way, you might say, in healthcare reforms that would help control overall costs. In other words, I don't think it's a case where you have to say, well, until we can reform the entire healthcare system, we can't do anything about Medicare or Medicaid. I think the federal government, which is a major healthcare provider and payer, can actually lead the way by changes in the Medicare program that could help enhance system-wide savings. What we're going to have to do is a number of things. I mean, there's no magic bullet here with controlling healthcare costs, and nobody's found the cure yet. I think there are a number of reforms that were in the ACA that are designed to help change the system in a way that would change provider payments, that would change the fee-for-service system into a more, a sort of a team-oriented approach, the so-called accountable care organizations. So there are a number of demonstration programs, pilot programs, that sort of thing in the ACA. Whether they will work, whether they will, save money, if they did save money, would be allowed to go into effect, because that would mean somebody would be getting less money somewhere. I don't know. I support those efforts, and I hope that they do control costs. But we're going to have to do a lot of those things, and we're going to have to get beyond things, referring to these things as death panels or rationing. We're going to have to, we're going to have to not just have an unlimited system as we do now. I think structurally, I think if you put some sort of budgetary goals on whether you do it through the IPAB, as the president's done, through the Independent Payment Advisory Board, or if you do it through a premium support model. And I don't think premium support is necessarily a dirty word. I think the way that Paul Ryan originally tried to implement it is not one that I would support, but I think Alice Rivlin and others have worked on a way that would, in effect, provide some sort of budgetary caps on the program. I think those things, that budgetary pressure, would actually help the ACA-type reforms be enacted, because if there's no pressure to have those cost-saving reforms enacted, I'm not sure that they will be, because it requires patients and providers to change behaviors that they're quite comfortable with. So I'm not sure, but anyway, so there's no magic bullet here. We're going to have to try a lot of things on healthcare costs. So why is that issue on the table? Because when you're talking about a sustainable fiscal policy, healthcare translates on the federal level at Medicare and Medicaid, and that's where the major cost growth is.
Bob?
So let me both respond to that question and in part to Bob's comment, and EJ, to your question of are there some places to save money here, and focus on Medicare. So I very much agree with Bob that we need Medicare to lead the way. Now, historically, a number of cost-saving reforms in the health insurance area, Medicare has led the way because Medicare has such huge buying power. The historical evidence shows it has more ability to drive system-wide change than the health insurance companies do. When Medicare put in certain reforms in the 90s, the insurance companies don't want to pay any more than they have to. They then pick it up. So the hope, and I say hope, we don't have certainty here, is that the combination of demos, pilots, comparative effectiveness research, things already starting, we are getting important early evidence that healthcare cost growth is slowing. We don't know if this is temporary and a blip or permanent. A growing number of healthcare experts are getting more optimistic that there may be something fundamental starting. I think the Affordable Care Act has something to do with driving that. And if we maintain this route, there's hope. We'll see. It's our best hope, in my view, for slowing the rate of growth of healthcare costs. My disagreement with Bob, I agree with everything until he got to this point, is I actually think that from a cost containment standpoint, premium support is one of the worst things we could do. And the reason I say that is for the reason I just mentioned, that under premium support, you lose the buying power of the big Medicare program. Even under the Rivlin version, it's simply one competitor with lots of private insurance companies, and most likely the healthier people go to the private insurers. And you lose the huge buying power that Medicare has, and I think its ability to drive reform through the healthcare system. I also think that if you did a premium support approach where you had a voucher, whatever you want to call it, that middle-income seniors get the value, and the value of which does not keep pace with healthcare costs, that within 5 to 10 years it would be ripped up, that the seniors wouldn't stand for it. Having said all of that, I do think as progressives that we sometimes make a mistake, given everything that's at risk, very much for low-income people among others, in saying that in none of these programs can we touch anybody's benefit at any level. There's a Medicare proposal. In the current Medicare system, we have a hodgepodge of deductibles that aren't very rational. And we then have, people have Medigap that buys around all the out-of-pocket costs. And the evidence is pretty strong it leads to some overutilization. There are proposals on the table to combine and unify the Medicare deductibles, put them at a level that produces significant savings, use a healthy share of those savings to, for the first time in Medicare's history, provide catastrophic coverage, which it does not provide today. That's another hole in the safety net. And to limit first dollar coverage in Medigap. Here's where I think in my view, the response from a low-income standpoint is not to say, this reduces the average benefit package in Medicare, it's terrible, but rather to say, if this otherwise makes rational sense, how do you design it? And this is where Bull Simpson falls short. How do you design it in a way that protects low-income people? So under the current structure, Medicaid would pay the increased deductible for people below the poverty line, and the minute you got to 101% of the poverty line, you're nailed. So you'd have an elderly widow with $12,000 or $15,000 a year who would face very high deductibles to go see the doctor, and in a number of cases would likely forego needed care. That's not the outcome we should have. So you use some of your savings and you do relief on a sliding scale from the increased deductibles and from co-payments from, say, 100 to 200% of the poverty line. And you're able to use some of the savings for deficit reduction. And frankly, if the panel, I think, is in agreement that we need a significant revenue contribution for deficit reduction. Politically, we're not going to get it unless there are some things like some changes on the beneficiary side in Medicare. The trick is to design them so they're good policy, they don't undermine cost containment, they don't lose the social insurance nature of the program, and they don't hurt the poor or the near poor. And I think that's doable. The other thing to look at there, again, controversial among progressives, is going somewhat farther on income-related premiums. Today we have higher Medicare premiums above $170,000 a year for couples, $85,000 for singles. Can we go somewhat lower? If we have bipartisan agreement and neither party attacks the other, I'd much rather get savings there than cutting Medicaid or food stamps or the earned income credit. But I think these are some of the challenges that face those of us on the progressive side of the aisle. We'll be forced sooner or later to confront some very tough choices like that.
Thank you so much. I'll let you come in on the last round. I want to go to one more question. I'll ask a question. I couldn't help but note, I'm staring this way, and as Bob was talking about healthcare, the Canadian flag is fluttering in the wind there. I was wondering if there's any inspiration sitting there. Let me go to this side of the room for one question, and then I'm going to have to stop. I will probably go, wait, did I see a hand up? All right, then I can just ask my question, and then we'll close it down. And this goes to my sort of comment on austerity as the sort of title of this panel. I mean, we are still in the middle of a very difficult economic situation. 4 job seekers for every job opening. We don't know what's going to happen in Europe. We don't want to fall into another recession. So, how do you, and I'll just go down the line, I guess I'll go Bob, or John has been out for a while. I'll go to John, Bob, and Bob. How do we get somewhere on deficit reduction without hurting the poor and without tossing our economy back into recession? John, you can respond to that. You can also respond to the inspirational comments of this gentleman that from earlier.
Well, I'm going with him.
I figured you might.
First of all, thanks for getting Micah right. Your point about not organizing, I think there's a lot to that, but we should remember there's an awful lot going on not here in Washington. One of the great things about my job is I oversee the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, which invests $10 million a year in local grassroots community organizing. And some of the best work, some of the most creative work is being done at the local level. We had IAF representatives in talking about how they work with community colleges and with employers to prepare young people and some not so young people for jobs that actually exist. I think PICO is doing some really interesting stuff on national policy as well as others. So some of the greatest energy and creativity is from the bottom up, not from that building over there. The other thing I want to say is talking about their voice and how we make change and how we get through this. And I think I might be echoing something that Ron Haskins said earlier. I want to be a part of the AND caucus on poverty. Seems to me we have an unhelpful, unreal, unproductive polarization on partisan lines, certainly, but ideological lines. Some people say it's all a matter of family. Kids having kids, people not graduating from high school, people not working. Other folks say you really got to understand the structural dimensions. There's racism alive. Immigrants are treated terribly. Wages are lousy, and then we have 4 people for every job. I think we ought to say yes to both of those. And we got to find a way to say that kids, and frankly, as somebody who's going to benefit from all these senior programs very soon, my view of this may be shifting, but we're investing way too much in seniors and not enough in kids. And that kids' lives are undermined or assisted by the choices their parents make and by the actions of their government. That personal responsibility matters, but so does social responsibility. That, in fact, we ought to look at things like family structure, we ought to look at labor market structure, and we ought to challenge both sides to come to the table and leave the pious rhetoric about helping the poor and say, can't we go at this in a way that recognizes reality? The kids in Cherry Hill, I talked to Paul Ryan at, it's true, minimum wage and food stamps and job training helps. But big part of the problem is that there are no guys around in a lot of those families. Big part of the problem is nobody before them has graduated from high school. Nobody's getting married. That's an exaggeration. And Charles Murray, with a long history, is now making that point that that's moving throughout the culture. So let's have a both and. Let's have a strategy that says we'll focus on the structural and economic dimensions. We'll also focus on personal and responsibility dimensions. I think one of the real pluses is that draws new people into this discussion. The evangelicals, I think, are a powerful force in this society, can be a powerful force in this debate. So let's find a way to put together the AND caucus and challenge both the extremes to come to the table.
Thank you, Reverend. Both Bobs, quickly because we're over time.
Okay, I think you raise a good fundamental question, which is there are 2 problems that we have here, and they're different and they can be treated differently. One is the short-term cyclical deficit that we have. It makes absolutely no sense to go after that with an austerity agenda. And particularly if it's aimed at the at poverty programs. I mean, that's insane. economics. Where we need to be looking at, and I don't like the word austerity either, but where we need to be looking at savings is over the long term. And I think there you can walk and chew gum at the same time. It's difficult to do politically. It's a difficult message. But you can continue to be accommodative, as they say at the Fed, in the short term while you're phasing in changes both on the tax and spending side over the long term that would achieve deficit reduction.
Thank you. And Bob.
Well, I agree with what Bob just said. It's what Peter Orszag these days calls the barbell. That you have a barbell, and on one end you have short-term immediate stimulus that the economy needs, and on the other end of the barbell is your permanent midterm, long-term deficit reduction. And clearly we need a lot more focus and a lot more efforts like the circle of protection. But I would say that the single most important issue for protecting the poor and deficit reduction is whether or not there is a significant revenue contribution. Without it, the poor will get nailed to the wall, and the math is inexorable here. We have really three areas of bipartisan agreement among the political leaders of both parties in the deficit area. I know we don't normally think of there being bipartisan agreement, but there are three areas. Number one, the leaders of both parties agree that we need at least enough deficit reduction over the coming decade to stabilize the debt as a share of the economy during the decade. That's at least $3 trillion in deficit reduction over 10 years. Both parties, the president, believe that strongly. Secondly, the leaders of both parties, including the president, are not interested in going beyond the defense cuts that were enacted last August as part of the Budget Control Act and taking defense down further. And the leaders of both parties are not going to do much to cut Social Security or Medicare benefits for current retirees. The Paul Ryan Premium Support Plan starts to phase in with people who turn 65 in 2023. So if you need $3 trillion, and there's not going to be much more from defense, little from Social Security in the first 10 years, just in the first 10 years, Medicare's maybe a few $100 billion. Where the hell do you get the money from? If you do not have a significant revenue contribution, you have two main parts of the budget left, and it's non-defense discretionary programs, a quarter of which funds low-income programs, and it's low-income entitlement programs, Medicaid, food stamps, SSI, the Earned Income Tax Credit, and the like. This is why it's not that Paul Ryan started in doing his budget to say, how do I screw the poor? But because he has no tax contribution and he fits all the other three things that I mentioned, he ends up having 62% of the deficit reduction in his first 10 years come in cuts for programs for the poor. If you don't have a significant revenue contribution, all else will fail in protecting programs for the poor. It is not a sufficient condition, but it is a necessary condition to get there.
Oh. I want to thank the panel. At the beginning of The Other America, Harrington quotes W.H. Auden, "Hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die." Thank you all for speaking in Auden's spirit and Mike Harrington's spirit. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to change